When I was 9 years old, I signed up to participate in my neighborhood swim team. Now, growing up in South Texas, summer lasted 9 months out of the year. So every neighborhood in town had a children's swim team. And most of my friends had been swimming on the swim team since about the time they could walk. By the time I turned 9, my parents' lack of enthusiasm about spending their Saturdays with 100 kids sweating at the swimming pool finally lost out to my desire to join in with the activity that all my friends were doing. Therefore, that summer, all throughout the months of June and July, I woke up early and I rode my bike to swim practice. Bleary-eyed, I took a deep breath and hopped into the glistening blue swimming pool, where a handful of 19-year-old coaches were waiting to teach me and my fellow teammates how to kick our legs and rotate our arms and contort our various body parts in order to perfect the freestyle and the backstroke and the breaststroke and the butterfly. The pool was 25 meters across. And for an hour each morning, the coaches yelled at us incessantly to swim faster and kick harder and turn better as we went back and forth, making more laps than I could count. If our feet touched the bottom of the pool, they would yell even louder. It was exhausting. By the time they blew the whistle to signal the end of practice, my lungs were pounding, my legs were weak, and my mind was frustrated by my body's unwillingness to keep up with all the skills and techniques that I was trying so hard to work on. So it's true what the prophet Isaiah says. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. Fast forward a couple decades to February 2020. Remember that one? 4 years ago, most of us had never heard of the coronavirus. We'd never lived in lockdown, never heard of social distancing, never been on a Zoom call, and with the exception of healthcare workers, most of us had never worn a surgical mask in our lives. When the pandemic broke in the United States in March of 2020, my daughter was 18 months old. She had just recently started walking and then running and then climbing, and she wanted to spend every waking moment exploring her brave new world. The early weeks and months of the pandemic were really hard for everyone for different reasons and in different ways. And one of the ways in which that season was difficult for me and for my husband was that our daughter was so little and yet so independent. She was too little to be left unattended for even a moment, but too big to be happy constrained within a playpen or a baby yard. Literally, we could not take our eyes off that child for a moment. Because if we did, she would happily put her hand on a hot stove or run into moving traffic or attempt to swallow anything that she could fit into her mouth. John and I split every day in half. In the mornings, I took care of Esme while my husband worked from home, frantically trying to get as much done as possible within the limited window of time that he had. And then when the clock struck 1, we would switch, and I would work while he was on toddler patrol. Now, perhaps this sounds like an amicable agreement, and in many ways it was, but without the ability to go to the park or the library or even the grocery store or meet up with friends, the lack of mental and social stimulation from caring for a young child for hours on end, for days on end, for months on end, was kind of mind-numbing. Of course, I say all this knowing that I was one of the fortunate ones. I was fortunate to be living with other people, fortunate to have access to outdoor space in my own backyard, fortunate to be able to work from home. But still, I felt so weary. Each new day, a seemingly endless stretch of hours in which we would do the same things, go nowhere, and talk to no one. It was difficult. As human beings, we are hardwired to grow tired and weary. Not just in extraordinary circumstances like the pandemic, but every day. Anyone who's ever held down a job for more than a couple hours knows what it feels like to be tired. Anyone who's ever served as a caregiver knows what it is to be weary. Anyone who's ever watched the nightly news knows what it is to be worn out. And even anyone who's ever been constrained to a couch or a bed or a chair due to poor health knows what it is to be exhausted simply from being. Call it burnout, call it resignation, call it the cost of being human. Life has a way of wearing us down. Now, this was certainly the case for the original audience of the prophet Isaiah. As if in an opposite extreme scenario to our pandemic lockdown, God's people had been forced by the government to leave their homes in the land that God had given them, and they were now living in exile. For them, the sometimes playful question we ask of what three things would you take with you to a deserted island was no game. It was reality. And whatever things they had chosen to stuff in their backpacks all those many years ago when the exile began was probably old or worn up or used up by this time. An entire generation of exile babies had been born without once ever going home. God's people were tired and weary. And it is in this context that Isaiah's prophecy, Isaiah's word from God to God's people, is to remind God's people that while they may be small and weak and weary, they have a God who is big and strong and powerful. And also, they have a God who is intimate and close, a God who sees them, a God who knows them, a God who knows each and every single one of their names, a God who numbers the very hairs on their heads, the God who knit each and every one of them together in their mother's wombs, a God who knows each person's deepest thoughts and hears their deepest cries and cares about the same concerns that they care about. Isaiah says to God's people, "Beloved, remember. Remember who your God is. Because when you remember who your God is, you will gain strength and energy for these challenging times." Beloved, I don't know about you, but for me, there is something about remembering how big my God is, and in comparison, how small I am, that really has a way of calming down the worries and the anxieties inside of me. Not that God doesn't care, because God does care. God cares very much. But because God is so big and I am so small, I know that God has a different perspective on my cares. It's like standing in front of the ocean or looking out from the top of a mountain and remembering this thing that I really knew all along and yet somehow so easily forget in the day-to-day reality of life, which is that the universe is incredibly massive and its detail so minute. And for millennia, the world has been turning, and the waves have been crashing, and cells have been splitting, and nations have been fighting, and mountains have been moving, and the seasons have been changing, and the same God who created all of this also created me, also loves me, also cares about the same things I care about simply because I care about them, also has a broader, more inclusive, more expansive and complete perspective on it all. And when I'm able to remember that, when I'm able to remember who my God is, I am filled with a kind of supernatural strength that allows me to know that no matter what happens, and it will happen, no matter what happens, God's got me. God's got us. We are going to be okay. I remember a couple summers ago sitting around the table after dinner, having a conversation with a close friend about some matter of theology. As a pastor, I have some pretty strong convictions about theology, as you might have noticed. However, to be honest, I really can't remember what the topic was that we were discussing that evening. But what I do remember is that my friend and I disagreed about something that mattered to me. And we disagreed about it in a way that was pretty unreconcilable. Now, I am a person who doesn't like conflict. I don't know if any of you are members of that club as well. So, as the conversation continued, the stress that I was feeling inside of me began to grow more and more. And just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore and I was trying to think of ways to extricate myself from the situation, my friend, who is much wiser than me, smiled, and she shrugged her shoulders, and she said, "Well, I guess one day we'll get to heaven, and then we'll find out we're both wrong." Yeah. I remember the first time I flew on an airplane as a child, peering out my window and looking down at the landscape below. I remember being mesmerized by how tiny the people and the trees and the houses were beneath me as the plane rose higher and higher in the sky. Even the semi-trucks speeding down the highway looked like tiny little ants crawling along. Even the longest, largest, most challenging swimming pools looked like nothing but raindrops, just a little blue dot on the broad, expansive landscape. Amen.